My name is Mike Livermore. We have a wonderful panel to discuss economics and environmental policy, a set of issues that is very close to the core of policy integrity's interests. Like I said, my name is Mike Livermore. I am currently on the faculty of the University of Virginia. I'm going to do very little speaking. I'm primarily just going to introduce our panelists here, which I will do in turn. You all have their bios and packets, so that I'm not going to do an extended introduction, but we have four wonderful panelists. Megan Ceronsky, who's the executive director of the Center for Applied Environmental Law and Policy. Dick Morgenstern, who's a senior fellow at Resources for the Future. Vickie Patton, who is the general counsel of the Environmental Defense Fund. And Jonathan Persing, who's the program director for environment at the Hewlett Foundation. And they will speak in that order. Just as a logistical reminder, we do have folks who will be circulating with cards for questions. We're going to follow that same format. So if you have questions for our panelists, please start filling out the forms now. We'll have about half an hour for Q&A. So we will start with Megan. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking Vickie and the rest of the incredible IPI family for having me here today. It's always wonderful to be here, especially thank you for inviting me. I am not an economist. I feel it's important to make that confession up front with this audience. Even though I am not an economist, I am going to take the liberty of offering some thoughts on the very, very narrow topic of EPA, economics, and the environment. As a non-economist, I have to confess that I do not love economics as an art form or as an intellectual puzzle. I am interested in economics purely from the perspective of what can economics do to advance environmental protection. And what I deeply appreciate about the work of the Institute for Policy Integrity is the rigor that they bring to this question and really the unflagging devotion and just tireless pursuit of this question of how can these tools be applied in a way that is making everyone better off? So thank you all for that work. This is a strange time in which we live. And one way to appreciate its strangeness, if you needed another one, is to actually think about this topic of EPA economics and environmental protection. If we go back in time 10 years, and I love the fact that Kathleen Frangione was here. If we go back in time 10 years, that will bring us to the massive effort to pass the Waxman-Markey climate legislation. And in that effort to pass the Waxman-Markey climate change legislation, the Clean Air Act played the role of boogeyman. So just to refresh your memory, a boogeyman is a mythical, evil creature that is used to scare children into behaving better. So we said to Congress, if you do not pass this legislation, the Clean Air Act is coming. And you heard these terrified squeals around the campfire as the children were very afraid of what would happen. Waxman-Markey would offer this economically efficient, economy-wide, not really economy-wide, but economy-wider approach. It will be market-based. We'll put a cap on emissions. There will be trading. We will get the most cost-effective emission reductions. We'll have an offsets program to even get more cost-effective emission reductions. If you do not pass this, the Clean Air Act will come and it will rain down horrible, inefficient, command and control regulations upon all of you. We did not pass the Waxman-Markey legislation. We could not convince enough conservative members of either party that they wanted to use these economically efficient, market-based tools to address the major environmental issue of our or any time. We then spent the next 6 years unmasking the bogeyman, who was, as it turns out, reasonably cute and cuddly, or at least very keen on efficient market-based approaches to address greenhouse gas emissions. So the two major climate pollution standards put in place under the Obama administration addressed the two major sectors in terms of emissions, transportation, and the power sector. Respectively, you had the Clean Car Standards and the Clean Power Plan. And the Environmental Protection Agency applied all of its remarkable ingenuity to this question of how can we design these frameworks to actually employ these efficient market-based frameworks to get the emission reductions we need in a way that is as cost-effective as possible. So the clean car standards, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, this was designed as a trading program. Effectively, you have averaging and trading, credits for things that cannot be measured at the tailpipe, et cetera, trading across the fleet, et cetera, and the Clean Power Plan based on, or at least implemented in the context of trading programs at the state level, if the states so chose, either rate-based trading programs or, to come full circle, a cap-and-trade program at the state level. So if we move forward to today, today we are in the middle of 2 public comment periods. This administration has put forward a proposal to roll back the clean car standards from model years 2020 onwards. The auto industry has not publicly sought this rollback. They instead have talked about how they want more of this market-based flexibility. What they would like is more credits for the things that you can do to reduce emissions that are not currently reflected in the program. Perhaps, we are going to put on this technology that's going to reduce traffic accidents, and when we reduce traffic accidents, we reduce traffic jams, and when we reduce traffic jams, then we reduce emissions. Credits for things like this. The Trump administration has not only failed to propose additional flexibilities and these market-based mechanisms under this program, they have actually proposed taking some of the core flexibilities out. So part of that program was looking at reducing emissions of very highly potent greenhouse gases from the air conditioning systems in cars, either by trading the actual refrigerants that you use for ones that are less potent greenhouse gases, or by reducing the leaks wholesale. That framework has been strongly supported by auto manufacturers because it allows them to find the most cost-effective ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, everybody's goal. And perhaps even more remarkably, in addition to trying to pull that framework out of the program, the Trump administration has said these very disparaging things about having a flexible regulatory framework at all. Like, these credits that you're getting for these, they're not real. It's like, really? Like, they're not? Okay. So that's what's happening in the context of the car standards. The second regulatory proposal that folks are now providing public comment on is the proposal to replace the Clean Power Plan. Under EPA's new proposed interpretation of the best system of emission reduction for greenhouse gas emissions and power plants, under the Clean Power Plan, as most of you remember, the best system of emission reduction was determined to be a combination of improving the heat rate or the efficiency of coal-fired power plants in combination with shifting generation from higher emitting generation sources to lower emitting generation sources, because you do not care how your electricity was made as long as it is in the outlet when you need it. So this was basically a shift from coal-fired power generation to gas-fired power generation, and from coal and gas-fired power generation to renewable generation. That is the framework that was actually being used by power companies and states on the ground to get reductions not just of greenhouse gas emissions, but of also other pollutants from the power sector. And then in that context, the EPA said to the states, here are the emission reductions we need you to get. You can do this using a rate-based trading program, or you can do this with a mass-based trading program, a cap-and-trade program. Now, EPA proposes to find that the best system of emission reduction, that's the statutory language, cannot involve an approach that is not based on a physical or operational change to the power plant itself. And has proposed to find that the best system of emission reduction under their new statutory interpretation is just the heat rate improvements at the coal-fired power plants, if the state finds that any of those look appealing on any time frame the state chooses to propose. So let's leave aside the pathetic and unlawful failure of this proposal to actually identify a best system of emission reduction, or to meaningfully address the danger to human health and welfare that is posed by greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants, as they are obligated by the law to do. Let us also leave aside the question of whether or not their new interpretation of the statute actually precludes a system like the Clean Power Plan or an analogous system. Let's focus on the fact that this administration is making the argument voluntarily that the Clean Air Act does not allow the use of economically efficient, market-based, flexible frameworks under the part of the act that will likely provide the foundation for climate mitigation policies for many years into the future, until that wonderful time when Congress acts. This is kind of remarkable. This administration will end soon. But the outcome of the coming litigation over this new proposed interpretation of the Clean Air Act could shape the nature of climate policy for many years into the future. Now, I would make what I think is a fairly unremarkable argument that this idea of how you can get emission reductions using averaging, using trading, using these flexible market-based approaches is the greatest gift that economics has given to environmental protection. In doing so, you have a system that is flexible for the regulated sources, you ensure that you're getting the most cost-effective emission reductions, and because you can get emission reductions more cheaply, you can actually get more emission reductions and more environmental protection. And I'm deeply grateful that this innovation came before the onset of the initial serious attempts to mitigate climate change, a problem that is particularly well suited to this approach because of the large number of sources that are a source of emissions, because of the need to provide that certainty and that market-based regulatory signal for the development of innovations in emission reductions, because of the scale of the emission reductions that need to be achieved, because of the deep interconnectivity between fossil fuels and the world economy, and because of the very important fact that every ton of greenhouse gases that is emitted has the same effect in terms of mitigation on climate change, no matter where you are reducing it, if we leave aside airplanes. So my gratitude to the economists who came up with these ideas, my gratitude to the conservative Republicans who put forward these ideas initially as policy frameworks. But remarkably, in this strange world that we live in, we have a Republican administration rolling back market-based, economically efficient environmental protections and replacing them with less flexible command and control frameworks. And we have these two competing visions of what is possible under the Clean Air Act. And these visions are swiftly heading to court. One vision is a return to command and control and actually making the Clean Air Act the boogeyman that we said it was, even when it wasn't, back in the Waxman-Markey days. Under that vision, should it actually become ensconced in the law, which is not certain, right? These cases could decide that that's one possible approach and it's okay for EPA to have done it this time and we could take a different approach in the future. But if that approach actually becomes ensconced in the case law as the only possible way to do this, we are going to be left with a deeply non-ideal policy tool going forward. Under that framework, if we think about the best system of emission reduction for the power sector in the context of an administration that was actually interested in fulfilling the law and its moral duty to address climate change, we would be looking at, let's take a coal plant, let's co-fire with a bunch of natural gas. Let's co-fire with 100% natural gas. Let's put on carbon capture and sequestration. We can reduce emissions under that framework, but it is not nearly as flexible or cost-effective as the alternative. The alternative is a system, a vision in which under the Clean Air Act, the best system of emission reduction can actually mirror the way that the power sector operates in practice. The ramping up and down of different generation sources, the flexibility in terms of who was generating electricity at any one point in time, and optimizing that generation to reduce emissions. That framework utilizes the policy tools that economics has given us to achieve emission reductions in a way that is as cost-effective, flexible, and efficient as possible. Now, thanks to the market forces that are accelerating the deployment of lower-emitting generation in the power sector, and to some really clutch tax credits, in retrospect, we are securing emission reductions in the power sector right now, regardless of what this administration does. But what we stand to lose is the potential to achieve the emission reductions that we are going to need going forward in a way that is flexible, efficient, and cost-effective. And that would be a terrible loss, and the antithesis of all of the incredible work that the folks at the Institute for Policy Integrity and others like them have been doing to try to develop environmental policy in a way that is as smart, thoughtful, cost-effective, and environmentally effective as possible.
Dick Morgenstern. Yep. Yep, Dick Morgenstern at Resources for the Future.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Vickie, for putting this wonderful event together. When I was putting together some notes for my remarks, I was thinking, gee, I need a title. What kind of title am I going to use? So I hastily wrote down Evolution and Challenges for Environmental Economics in Decision-Making. And then Michael said, well, you only have 10 minutes. So let's see how I can do here, okay? So it's widely believed that environmental economics, as we know it today, which includes economic incentives, that wonderful invention that Megan referred to, and also includes cost-benefit analysis, that it has its roots in the conservative Reagan administration, particularly the cost-benefit side, the Executive Order 12291. Well, the history buffs in the room will recognize that that's not really fully the story, okay? That during the Carter administration, there was actually a good deal of work on these very topics. There was not quite the mandate to carry them out, perhaps, that was occurred in the Clinton administration, in the Reagan administration. But they did a lot of work on economic incentives back in the Carter era. And they had the beginnings of the capacity at EPA. They had economists working on willingness to pay and measurements of benefits, although it had not been fully put into operation. So that's a long time ago. Now, what are the key trends over the past 40 years in this field that kind of jump out at you, okay? So I guess one of them is that the field of environmental economics has blossomed. It's gone from very, very, very small to a major cottage industry. Where I work, Resources for the Future, many people think that we had a near monopoly on the subject back 40 years ago. I'm not sure that's totally correct, but we were certainly a big part of the story. People like Alan Knesa was a major person in this field. And today, every serious university has one or more environmental economists on their staff, and there are many institutes and organizations, and the environmental community has now embraced environmental economics, and they have economists. So the field has blossomed, and it's now a huge activity. But that implies that there's been a lot of new data developed, techniques, analytic methods, and this applies to cost benefit, applies to economic incentives, applies to, frankly, other topics too that I'm not going to go into. Now, it's also true that the Reagan executive order, it actually did two things, as probably everybody here knows. It established requirements for cost-benefit analysis, but it also institutionalized a role for OMB. And that institutionalized role has, from its very beginning, been controversial. And the organization, OIRA, which we have Sally here is one of the former heads of OIRA, okay? OIRA has existed over every president since Reagan, and it has, it's a complex story as to what it's played out. I guess the points I would make is that its role has somewhat waxed and waned across administrations. I would say that it had many effects, okay, on regulation, but one of the probably unintended consequences is that the institutionalization of OMB probably slowed the adoption of benefit cost analysis by the environmental community. And it wasn't until Vickie and Michael wrote a fabulous book that we all love, okay, it was many years later, that kind of heralded the need for the environmental community to embrace benefit cost analysis. And as I said, they have now done so, and that's fabulous. But the OMB role, as it was constituted in the original order, I think is quite complex. Now, at EPA over the years, economists have worked diligently. I counted myself among that crowd many years ago, to increase net benefits, which means to look at individual rules and find ways of increasing overall benefits and reducing costs. And the contribution which they have made has been documented by many over time. Everybody thinks of the big winners like lead phase down in gasoline, but in fact there's many other winners out there too, where there have been major impacts on regulations that were driven by economics from within EPA that have increased net benefits, which is the metric that we hold in highest regard. Now, in the early Clinton years, those of you who, again, are history buffs, you remember that there was a very intense debate about the fate of this executive order. Should it continue to exist, or should it be eviscerated? And it was a very, extremely intense debate, and there were many strong feelings on the subject. I'm pleased to say that the 25th anniversary of that executive order was just celebrated. It's now newly named, of course, at that time, 12866. And 12866, as people like Cass and others have written, is a fairly small departure from 12291. There is a greater emphasis on equity, there's more transparency for OMB and a few other changes, but it's largely a legitimization of the need to do rigorous economic analysis by the federal government before rules are issued. And as I say, the 25th anniversary was I understand it was a great party you had. Okay. So the last several decades have seen a lot more progress, okay? There's more technical sophistication of these studies. There's growing use of the information in decision-making, applied to water benefits, applied to air pollution for sure. Another great example, which Cass mentioned, is the social cost of carbon, okay?
Now what's prominent in the structure is a vision that it has to have all parties. But you know what? Most parties in the world don't believe the market works in their favor. So while there is language that opens up the door to a market vision and a market structure, the agreement under the final deal in Paris mentions that, but it's in rather oblique language that, unless you're quite sophisticated, wouldn't leap out as you as a framework that you would apply and say, here's my market, go at it. And oddly enough, the country that's developed the best market program since we did that, China. So here you have some remarkable evolution in the process. The US insists that market are right, and we've heard from our panelists earlier, well, we're a little wishy-washy on how you might implement that vision. At the end of the day, though, the others haven't done much better. And to me, the question that I think we have to raise is the market structure that we've outlined one that has these optimal solutions, one that gives us these least cost scenarios, is it politically tenable? The numbers speak to a certain extent in a pretty loud voice. I worked in the period between the Bush administration. I was hoping it would be a shorter period, but I worked at the World Resources Institute. And one of the things that I ended up doing was facilitating the negotiations at RGGI, a fabulous market system, an effort to try to bring together a process in which the states would design a collective action. How are they doing? It's about $5 a ton. All right, I then decided, let's go work on California. Here's a progressive place. Fabulous set of things are going on. How are they doing? Fabulous, about $15 a ton. I was at the International Energy Agency at the time where the European Union was designing its market structure, and we worked extensively with them in the design of that vision. They were progressive, they were active. How are they doing? Oh, they're a bit ahead of California. They're at 15 euros a ton. So a 20% increase. It is not obvious that we're coming close to what we have to do. So let's back up and take a look at what we might do as a different model. Let's look at the modeling scenarios, at the way the world has approached this from a modeling perspective and where it might go. Well, one of the things we ended up doing was the social cost of carbon, and Dick has worked on this. Many of us have worked on this extensively. It's built on certain presumptions about what the future might look like and what kinds of damages you might see, and we do complicated, fully integrated AOGCMs. They're really nice. They're quite sophisticated. We end up with numbers that range substantially, but hovering somewhere in the $40 a ton range. So the first thing we can say is that 15 is radically short of that. The second thing we can say is that nobody's at 40. The third thing we can say is those models are deeply flawed. Why are they flawed? What kinds of things did they not consider that we ought to have looked into? Well, it turns out when we did some of the original modeling, we had certain expectations around technology growth. They've largely been wrong. We've had some extraordinary advances. I've moved to California. We had a big meeting last week, a week before last, called the Global Climate Action Summit, hosted by Jerry Brown, and a great number of the cohort involved in that conversation were people looking at the technologies that when I began working on the climate file didn't even exist as a glimmer in my eye. right? I went and had a big meeting with the folks at Salesforce who can do things with data that I couldn't even imagine doing, and I worked on a Wang computer system at the State Department in 1990, and if you haven't seen a Wang system, you don't want to. It's remarkably, remember the orange cursor? You know, it's a long time back, we didn't have a Salesforce in our future. That wasn't in the model. We had no vision that the price of renewables when we began that work would be so much cheaper than the price of coal. That wasn't in the model. Yesterday I had some information. I've been here for Climate Week, which is part of the UN conversation, had a series of discussions with some other folks. Dalmia, which is the largest cement company in India, now has the capacity to manufacture cement with 0 emissions. That didn't exist. It's not in our models. We don't know how to do that. Are they right? They think they're right. There's some new assessments that are being done by the cement industry which look at the stress tests for that cement. Interestingly enough, it performs as well, if not better, on corrosion, on resistance, and on compressive strength. This is not in the model. So at one end, the model did not give us any sense of the potential on the upside. On the downside, the model didn't value the consequence of the loss of Tuvalu, or the loss of the Marshall Islands, or the loss of Miami. How do we account for that? Well, that was somebody else's problem, and on average, don't worry, it's not a huge risk. We didn't take it into account. None of these are fatal flaws. Had we applied a $40 a ton model and imposed it, and our price has gone there, I'm actually quite convinced we would have solved a great number of these problems, but they didn't fix the politics. And to me, the politics become one of the central elements that are not adequately addressed in our nice theories, either on the legal side or the economic side. So I want to come back to one last piece on the economics and where it might take us. Because a different dimension right now is not around the long-run vision of a future world, of a 2050 scenario, which gets me down to 0 carbon, which is, by the way, what I have to do. And a report that'll come out in give or take some about 3 weeks in early October from the IPCC will essentially say, actually, guys, you should not be at 2 degrees, you should be at 1.5 degrees. So the number that we're going to end up with on $40 a ton is radically understating the actual cost in the near term of the transition. But we need to also start to think about some of the other pieces on finance. And that brings me to the last point that I want to make. A lot of finance is not predicated on perfection. It's actually predicated on the imperfections in the market that enable you to make certain investments that are profitable because you're doing better than the herd that you follow. We did an exercise to think about this and put some real money into it. So I now work at the Hewlett Foundation. And the Hewlett Foundation has decided that one of the things we need to do is raise substantial capital to move into this marketplace. We need about $1 trillion a year is the best insight that we can currently glean. And whether it's 1.2 or it's 0.8 or even if it's 2, $1 trillion a year is starting to be real money, right? They add up. At the end of the day, the question is, how do you do that? The collective asset of all of fossil fuels, $7 trillion. The collective asset of all renewable energy, about $300 billion. Mismatch. I have to figure out how to get the investment to go the other way and scale it up at that kind of an extent. What are governments putting in? We collectively committed to $100 billion a year. I need $1 trillion a year. I'm off by at least that factor, if not more. So how do I think about that? The risk in the assessment currently says I oughtn't to do that. It's not a good investment to invest in these things. I will lose my money. The risk is too high for currency exchange. The risk is too high for technology. The risk is too high because we don't have the right kind of policy environment. The risk is too high because I can't repatriate my capital. All of those kinds of risks basically say that I can't really invest in India, which is where emissions are going up, or Indonesia, which is where emissions are going up. I can invest in the United States, but you know what? Even in this administration, emissions are essentially flat. I have to play this as a global question and move out in a different way. So we're trying to de-risk some of those investments. And we're doing it not because we bet on the model, but because we bet that we bet on the last 30 years. We bet that the history of technology is likely to be reprised, even if the models don't fully capture it. We bet that countries are likely to take action, even if it's not optimized. We bet that in some ways, if you go down the wrong road, we can't sustain or afford that, and therefore we should find other scenarios. And what was fascinating, and we made this announcement at the One Planet Summit with Macron just earlier this week, is that we actually got takers. So the Hewlett Foundation, joined by the Grantham Foundation and IKEA, put up some money, and we have commitments from the development agencies in France and some Germany, and we've got BlackRock buying in with us to create a new fund. That's not exactly a modeled approach. It's not exactly an economically efficient approach, but actually might help us solve the problem. And from my narrow little window as a US negotiator, as looking at this from some historical perspective, I'm willing to take that last. I like the optimized scenario. I use it in my thinking. I use it as an input to help me understand where the world might go and what I have to avoid. But then I try to look at the practical solutions of what I can do. And to me, that's a pretty wide open field. And boy, we'd love some input on that. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks very much to our speakers. That's all been, he's put a lot of super interesting issues on the table. So, by the way, we have folks coming around. If you have questions, feel free to put them on index cards. I'll go through those and ask some of those. But just to kind of get us started, you know, one of the themes that several folks have raised is this kind of ships passing in the night, like element to American politics and environmental economics over the last, say, 30 years. That there was a period of time when cost-benefit analysis and markets were embraced by kind of more conservative folks and folks in the Republican Party, really championed by folks in the Republican Party. And EDF was actually one of the early groups to kind of go out and took a lot of heat for being one of the early groups to embrace these approaches. But now the kind of the politics have flipped, and even at an international level, like China's the big champion of markets, right? Who would have thought 20 years ago? And so I wonder if we could just kind of think about what might explain that. It's a bizarre phenomenon. It's very strange. It's striking. What accounts for it? Is it just a naturally occurring political process? Is it specific choices that were made by leaders at different times? Is this a strategic thing? Is it something just happened in the background? So I put that to the panel for your thoughts on that. Maybe start with Vickie, just because she's furthest away from me.
I think, pendulum swing and some of the dichotomies that you described are in large part really, I think, part of the policymaking process in that there have been kind of these repeated efforts to try to forge common ground on some really important sort of major transformative policy, and a thinking that if you could design public policy in a way that was more efficient and achieved important public health and environmental protections, that would be a way to sort of to break through the logjam and to secure these outcomes. And then I think we find ourselves in a context at times where the obstructionists are so entrenched and have so much political power that they can prevent sort of even kind of the most rational policy. So those of us who think about the world in terms of, you know, looking for that kind of rational policy design that's going to bring people together and provide these important public health and environmental protections, find this world very sort of confounding and frustrating. But fundamentally, I think it's because there are instances in American life when, you know, the polluters are just driving the politics and thwarting sort of any kind of meaningful progress. And so what we find is that, like right now in America, lawsuits are proliferating over climate. Why are lawsuits proliferating over climate? Because it's a serious problem that affects people's lives, right? It has huge consequences. And so in a world where there's not a rational, thoughtful, meaningful national policy, community groups, concerned environmental groups, people who are impacted by the clear and present danger of climate change are going to look for, you know, ways to try to effectuate protections and get action. I think it's in part just a reflection of the politics.
Okay, I'm gonna interpret your question, Michael, as a little bit, if I could, and say what you're really talking about is why did the idea of market-based mechanisms take so long to catch on? Is that part of, that's I think a major.
Yeah, I mean, and well, at the same time, some have abandoned the idea, but it is an interesting. It's kind of like the first half of the question.
Okay, so I came across a quote which I was going to use in my remarks and I didn't, but now I've got an opportunity. I've got it right here. Tom Schelling, the late Tom Schelling. Okay, Nobel Prize winner. He wrote, "Policy judgments are easier to come by the further we are from our goals. If there are only two directions, we know which way is forward, and there are limits to how fast we can go, no fine discrimination is needed. We can worry about how much is enough when we get close, if we ever do." And essentially, the environmental field, I mean, let's face it started 50 years ago, if you want to think of it in terms of federal law, and we didn't know anything. I mean, we were starting from scratch. It was an outcry, a public outcry that there's a problem here. And so you don't need economists to do that. You really need somebody who just knows how to move forward. That's all you got to do. Move forward in a somewhat practical way. I mean, and that's what I think the first decade or more of environmental protection was. And then over time, I think a lot of people realized, well, gee, I'm not quite on board with this. And or maybe there was some overreach occasionally. And so the idea of introducing some technique of looking for cheaper, better ways of getting the job done and looking for more effective ways of making these decisions, quite apart from the technique that was used to get there, just became obvious. And you know, fortunately, some economists who were writing at the turn of the century had written some theoretical work, the turn of the last century, that is, had written theoretical work that was available to be adapted and expanded, and many people in this room have played a key role in that. So I think that's a good news story, but that's my 30 seconds here.
I just want to add one thing to what I commented on earlier, which is that I'm not entirely persuaded that people are making irrational decisions here. We kind of accuse them of being blinded and not paying attention, and that the greater good should actually hold. But I think Cass is right in many of the ways he thinks about it in terms of what information does and where you take it. But if I look at the average, I can still drown in a 3-inch stream if there's that deep pool. And if I'm the person whose plant is closing and whose coal factory is being shut down, and it paid a union wage, and the job that I can get is at McDonald's, which pays 1/4 as much with no benefits, I'm actually okay with that coal plant. And I'm okay with thinking about that. And you know, you can tell me to move to California because it's sunny and bright, but I don't have a community that lives there that when I don't find a job will get me food, and we'll have a church community to which I belong, and we'll have a process and a place that I've lived in and my family's been in for 5 generations. That model is not being taken into consideration in our economic thinking, and to me is a fundamental issue. That's why it's so persuasive when folks who do have their ox being gored, who do have money, and who apply that money, find an active listenership.
I got my own. So those were all, I think, extraordinarily insightful reactions. I will just add a couple of very small points. I mean, one is that things haven't shifted as much as we are presenting them to have shifted, in that there is still deep unease amongst much of the left about market-based policy mechanisms, and that doesn't appear to be going away anytime soon. Two, I gave this very simplistic, sort of for the sake of humor, framework earlier about how we couldn't get the conservatives in the two parties to elect this super economically efficient market-based solution. Well, of course, the answer is, to that problem is not that they don't like economically efficient market-based frameworks. They were not convinced that they wanted to take a vote on climate change that was going to carry costs in the near term. And we still have a political system, it's called a democracy, where people get elected in the very short term when those costs are short term. Climate change is a really hard political problem with our political system. China has it a hell of a lot easier than we do. That is not a joke. They have it so much easier than we do in terms of actually dealing with climate change. I mean, we could also have benevolent dictators. They would also have it easier. We have democracy, so we have to deal with that. And part of what happens in our democracy, in modern American politics, is it's oppositionally defined. So once cap and trade and climate change became defined as a Democratic Party priority, it automatically became defined as something that the Republican Party was going to deeply oppose. And I don't know how to fix that. That is the nature of our presidential sort of head of the party system that we have right now. And so I think that answers a lot of it way down. And then just to return to, I think, the really provocative thoughts that Jonathan was throwing out there, that we live in a world where we have to not be focused on the perfect and the ideal policy, but how do we optimize the suboptimal situation that we find ourselves in, which is what the Obama administration was doing for 8 years, trying to make existing authorities work. It's what we're all doing in our work when we try to deal with the world where, it might be that a renewable energy policy is an easier thing to sustain politically than a much more cost-effective, economically efficient policy, and part of that is we have to change the politics, and part of it is we use whatever we can at any particular moment. But for me, what I keep coming back to in the context of market-based mechanisms is the scale of the problem that we have to deal with here is so massive. If you think about chemistry, like what is the activation energy of like actually getting the reaction to go to the other side? When you're talking about lower cost ways of addressing the problem, it's a lower activation energy and easier to sustain that reaction going forward, because that's what we have to do. We have to sustain action over the next 30 years in order to actually fix this problem. And so I think Jonathan has posed a really challenging and important question about like, when do we have to give up the ideal and actually go with things that are going to make more of a difference? And while at the same time, I think, continuing to try to make sure that whatever the downsides are of whatever track we're on, be they cost, be they politics, be they whatever, we're trying to minimize those so that we can sustain the response.
Great, thanks for those thoughts. Just to turn to some of the questions in our pile here, we'll only get to a couple of them. But so one question is whether the way that this administration has proceeded on cost-benefit analysis, on its kind of regulatory agenda, will ultimately undermine the legitimacy of cost-benefit analysis going forward. So if it becomes the case that the public views cost-benefit analysis as easily manipulable, kind of a sham story that's told ex post to justify decisions that are made on other grounds, and maybe some for the worst possible grounds, that it just loses its legitimacy, and then in the next administration, even if they were disposed to use cost-benefit analysis, they just might not find it to be particularly attractive politically, or they just might come into office and not feel the kind of need to justify themselves in terms of cost-benefit analysis, because it's just, again, has lost that legitimacy with the public.
I'll take the first shot here. I think it's certainly possible that this is going to undermine legitimacy of cost-benefit analysis. But in the end, I guess, there is a body of credible experts, okay? And the credible experts can and do legitimize these analyses, not every day in every way, okay? And, for example, on this ANPRM that was released recently, large numbers of economists have written in saying that this is ridiculous, okay? That taking co-benefits out of the game is nonsense, okay? So the administration is not going to have the legitimacy to do that. And going forward, it seems to me that the opportunities are there for an administration, Democratic administration, Republican administration, anybody to come in and essentially re-embrace the benefit side of benefit cost analysis, and to do so in a legitimate way that is a way forward. So I'm optimistic, but I recognize the risk.
Any other takers on that?
I think it's what we're living through now is, I think, a really important example of what happens when policymaking is not rational, when it's transactional, right? When people who have people with very narrow access to power have full sway over whether human health and the environment gets protected. Just one small example, Scott Pruitt's final day in office late on a Friday, he issued a memo that categorically provided that the Environmental Protection Agency would not enforce pollution limits on diesel trucks that address a particular class of diesel trucks where you take an old engine, 10, 15, 20 years old, and you put it in a modern frame. Those old engines emit lethal particulates at 450 times or more of modern clean diesel engines. and transient conditions, and we're subject to modern pollution limits adopted in 2016. He said, we're not going to enforce those modern pollution limits, just categorically. Didn't support it with any analysis, didn't support it with any explanation, has huge impacts on the health and well-being of all across America, including communities that have for far too long borne the heavy burden of diesel exhaust and diesel pollution. We filed legal action, and within 24 hours, there was an administrative stay. I think when the American people, I think when judges, I think when, people see what the alternative is, which is a policy decision that was made to serve the interest of one company in Tennessee that has as its business model putting polluting diesel engines in a modern cab, and had special access to Scott Pruitt, and they see that kind of corruption, I think it moves us toward a world where we want better analysis and we want more transparency. At the same time, we need to be really, really thoughtful in how we're prioritizing sort of America's public health and environmental, priorities, so that we don't have a world in the next administration where, in any way, shape, or form, we are not addressing sort of the clean water crisis in America. We have got to sort of make sure that in all of our conversations about environmental and public health priorities, we are taking actions that are just central to the lives of all Americans, including communities in Flint and communities in Alabama and all across the country that have lead in untenable concentrations in their drinking water. So I think it'll be a more rational world, and I think it'll be a world where we're all going to be challenged to make sure that we have priorities in our policies that are addressing urgent crises.
If I could just add one small comment from the international perspective. One of the things that I am struck by is how much the world used to follow the United States, and how much and how quickly that shifts. So there's a negotiation currently underway to finish the rule book for the Paris Agreement, which is the details of how transparency works. And at this particular moment, the United States is pressing, frankly, for what it's always pressed for, because there's been nobody home to give any different guidance. And so the administration is basically taking the line from the last 3 administrations. But the rest of the world has now said, we don't believe you anymore. We don't like you. We're not going to do what you ask us to do. The fact that it may be consistent and rational, we have a different set of agendas that we are pursuing, and there are some real things that we, and take a China or a Saudi Arabia or an India, these are not our priorities. They may have been your priorities, and we'll get locked into a deal that because we have a less forceful and less clear position domestically will redound to a global change to our disbenefit.
Okay, great. So, well, not great, but but moving on. We just have a couple more minutes. So let me just offer one final question, and maybe we can just do. And this is a hard question, actually. So we'll do short answers to hard questions. So the question concerns how you integrate distributional analysis into economic analysis. Vickie, you mentioned this in your talk. So is the idea to integrate distributional analysis directly into cost-benefit analysis? The tradition of EPA has been to treat them somewhat distinctly, to do efficiency analysis on the one hand and a distributional analysis of some sort on the other. Employment effects can be thought of as one category of these kinds of distributional considerations. And so just a question for a quick reflection is, how does one see the interaction of economic analysis and distributional analysis going forward?
Well, I agree 100% with Vickie who's raising the point here. I think this is a really important issue in the question you're raising as well. So it's a challenge for economics, okay? Because there is no simple answer that can arrive. Economics is organized principally around efficiency, but distribution is something that we're quite capable of calculating, and we have models that do it, some better than others. And the question is there always one answer that gets you the most efficient and the most distributionally favorable policy? And of course, the answer to that is no. So what economics tries to do when it's done correctly is to highlight what the trade-offs are. I mean, it may be that the goal, that efficiency for some problems may be most important, and distribution may be most important for others. And I think all that economics as a discipline can contribute is the tools to try to figure out what the outcomes are under different scenarios. And I think there's not going to be, I can't imagine there ever being in my lifetime or anyone's lifetime, a framework for suddenly picking that magic one that is best for all cases, because it probably doesn't exist.
Well, unless anyone else had something to say on that, then please join me in thanking our speakers for a really wonderful conversation. We have more questions, but we are out of time.